Namaste and greetings. I, Mahi Duggar, a researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, New Delhi, extend my warmest welcome to you all to IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today, we have gathered for a distinguished lecture on the topic Achieving Sustainable Development by Dr. Keith Alverson. As a part of the series, The State of Environment, #Planet Talks, organized by IMPRI, Center for Environment, Climate Change and Sustainable Development, we are honored to have Dr. Keith Alverson as our speaker for today. Dr. Keith Alverson is an independent professional in the field of oceans, climate, and environment. He is currently working as a consultant for the World Meteorological Organization as lead coordinating author of the implementation plan for the Global Climate Observing System. Dr. Keith was director of the UNEP International Environmental Technology Center in Osaka, Japan from 2016 to 2020. The center is a global center of excellence on environmentally sound technologies with a focus on waste management. Prior to that, he served for 5 years as the director of the Freshwater, Land and Climate Branch at UNEP headquarters in Nairobi, Kenya, where he oversaw UNEP's global portfolio of the projects in climate change, adaptation, and ecosystem-based climate change mitigation, as well as terrestrial and freshwater ecosystem management. From 2004 to 2011, Dr. Keith was head of the Ocean Observations and Services at the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO, based in Paris, France, as well as the director of Global Ocean Observing System. Prior to 2004, he was the executive director of IGBP Past Global Changes project in Bern, Switzerland, coordinating global cooperation in paleoclimatic and paleo-environmental research. Dr. Keith has a degree in mechanical and aerospace engineering with a concentration at the Energy for Center and the Environment, along with a certificate in East Asian Studies from Princeton University, 1988, and a doctorate in physical oceanography from Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, 1995. His postdoctoral research in modeling past climate variability was in the physics department at the University of Toronto, Canada. Dr. Keith has over 150 publications, including Resilience, The Science of Adaptation to Climate Change, Global Change and the Future Earth, Past Global Changes and the Significance for the Future, Paleoclimate, Global Change and the Future, Watching Over the World's Oceans and Taking the Pulse of the Oceans. He has served on a number of high-level scientific panels, including as elected President of the International Commission for Climate of the International Association of Meteorology and Atmospheric Sciences, Secretary General of the International Union of Geodesy and Geophysics Commission for Climate and Environmental Change, and the chair of United Nations Interagency Coordination and Planning Committee for Earth Observations. We welcome you, sir. Our discussants for today are Dr. Ram Boojh, who is the CEO of Mobius Foundation, New Delhi, and Dr. Rema Saraswathy, Member Secretary and Chief Functionary, Institute of Sustainable Development, Chennai. It is a pleasure to have you both here. Our moderator for the session is Dr. Simi Mehta, CEO and Editorial Director at IMPRI, and I now invite Dr. Mehta to take the proceedings forward, and we look forward to learning from our esteemed panelists. Thank you, and over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Mahi, and good evening to everyone from India. We hope that you're all well and hearty and also safe. and in the best of your health. So today we have actually gathered here to experience a distinguished lecture by our mentor, Dr. Keith Alverson, on a topic that affects not just us at present, but also to everyone in the future generation, which is sustainable development. Actually, a lot has been said and spoken and written about the need for sustainable development. And in fact, especially since the Brundtland Commission report of 1987 came out. But despite knowing that there needs to be a development pattern which should be sustainable, we are really on the risk or on the verge of risking it all, especially all the pillars of sustainable development, like social, economic, and environmental. And also we are on the verge of squeezing the lives of those, especially those in the margins. So how do we achieve sustainable development? Let us hear from the expert himself, Dr. Keith Alverson. Welcome, sir, and the stage is yours. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Simi. Thank you, Mahi, for the introduction. I'll start with the slides, but while we're pulling those up, let me mention some news. I think all of you may have heard that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has released its part 1 physical basis of climate change of its 6th report this week. And you've probably seen that in the newspapers, some clips or whatever. Just tell you my perception very quickly. Nothing new in this report. Everything in this report was already said in the 5th report in 2014. So all of the incentives or the scientific basis for dealing with the climate change problem was already the case in 2014. In 2014, the IPCC said climate change driven by mankind is unequivocal. And that they've said the same thing now with some slight wording changes, saying there's warming in the atmosphere, ocean, and land. Last time they just said atmosphere and ocean. These changes are very small. Some I's have been dotted, some T's have been crossed, and some good science has been done. But fundamentally, we have to ask ourselves why we had such a good report in 2014 and we did so little. I hope that this report is a better trigger for action, but fundamentally nothing has changed as a result of this report, some slight changes of scientific interest. But let's move on with the talk. So please, the slides. I hope I can see them so I can remember what to say.
Yes, sure. Yeah.
I had seen them very briefly and then but now they've gone away again.
Actually, yes, Dr. Arjun, if you could put those slides.
Well, here we go. So the title of the talk, Achieving Sustainable Development, and we've already heard a introduction to me, so I won't mention it. That picture there is of the Environmental Technology Center that I was formerly director of until the end of 2020, although it has now vanished again from my screen. Excellent. Can we have the next slide? So obviously the thank you, I'd like to thank Simi. We've had a bit of an interaction only over email because it's been entirely, I think, during this COVID period. And all of you, both the panelists who I haven't met yet, but I look forward to learning more of your opinions, Dr. Boojh and Dr. Saraswathy, and everyone who is listening. It's great to be with you today. Next slide, please. So this is my outline of the talk. I've put it on a picture of the icons of the UN agreed Sustainable Development Goals. I'll be talking first a little bit about the goal number 1, no poverty. Then I will be talking about waste management in particular. And within this framework, it falls in Development Goals 11 and 12, which are for sustainable cities and communities and responsible consumption and production. And finally, the climate issue. I started with a little bit of talk about IPCC, but the climate goal 13. As you will see as I go along, I've left some thinking exercises on the bottom of the slides. Here I ask if the audience thinks the goals need to be updated, because it doesn't say pandemic anywhere. There's no mention of pandemic. Do we need to update goals like this? These are things I may talk about a little or I may not, but if you're finding my talk too slow and you already know what I'm saying, you can think about those. So let's go on to the next slide. So the SDGs, as they're called for shorthand, there are 17 of them. We just saw them. I'll be talking a little bit about 3. They're underlined by specific targets. So 169 targets, and each of the targets is described by 1 or sometimes 2 indicators for tracking progress against these targets. And the reason that the goals have been developed that way is to ensure that they are so-called SMART criteria. SMART is an acronym widely used in business and government. I've spelled it out here for you in case you don't remember: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So I think this SMART acronym came mostly from the business community. And one of the questions I'll be asking as we go along is, how relevant is this really to sustainable development? You see below, I have a couple of questions already that you can, if it's a attainable or if it's a time-bound goal. For example, goal number 1 is remove poverty by 2030. What happens in 2031? We achieved it in 2030 and everybody can go back into poverty in 2031. That's not a sustainable goal. It's a time-bound goal. So anyway, let us continue, and you can think about that as we move along. Next slide, please. So the goal number 1 is end poverty in all its forms everywhere. The target that has been agreed to for this goal is by 2030, eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as people living on less than $1, this is US dollar, $1.25 a day. And the indicator to measure progress towards this goal is the proportion of population below that international poverty line by sex, age, employment status, and geographical location, specifically urban, rural. So those are the exact terms agreed by all the member states of the United Nations. So let's have a little look at that indicator, the poverty $1.25 a day limit. Next slide, please. So here's a graph, which I pulled from the World Bank, showing their estimates of this poverty indicator from 1820 on the left side of the curve until 2015, the year that these SDGs were approved. In red, you see the number of people living below the poverty line, and in green, the number of people living above the poverty line. And obviously this curve rises because the population of the Earth has gone up substantially from about 1 billion in 1820 to 7 billion in 2015. So I'd like you to notice 2 things about this poverty line. The first is that between 1820 and about 1970, the vast majority of the world's population, 99% to maybe 90% in 1970, were living in poverty, as defined by this indicator. So one question you can ask yourself is, okay, between 1820 and 1950, is it true that 90% of the world's population were suffering because they lived below this poverty line? And I would say the answer is probably no, that this indicator was probably not as valid as you might think, especially in the early years, because a lot of the economy was not based on cash income. People had other forms of wealth that were, if you're a subsistence farmer in India, for example, growing your own crops, you may not have very little cash income, but have a relatively secure life. I'm thinking about before 1900 and not feel that you are in poverty. So that's one thing to consider, is how relevant is this $1.25? Of course, it's normalized by inflation, poverty indicator as an indicator of, unhappiness or lack of ability to have basic needs met. Second thing I'd like you to notice about the curve is from about 1970 until 2015, poverty was dropping extremely rapidly. So by 2015, you can see that only about 10% of the population of the world was living below this poverty line. And there had been extremely rapid progress in decreasing the percent of the population globally that was living below the poverty line. Much of that progress was occurring in Asia. China and India are good examples of countries that were rapidly increasing their economic wealth and rapidly increasing their transition into cash economies where people earn money. So they were coming out of the poverty index. So you might ask the question, well, in 2015, when the member states signed up to this goal, well, it was already being taken care of. The drop was extremely rapid. So they were sort of signing up to a goal that appeared to be happening anyway. So what happened after they signed up to this goal in 2015? Let's look at the next slide. Next slide, please. Oh, I guess I'm not showing you quite yet. I wanted to sprinkle in through the talk a little bit of local Indian relevance. Please, I'm sure the audience knows much more about all this than I do, so please consider calling me to task on any of these comments in the question and answer session. But one of the differences, of course, in any of these indicators, the difference in global and local. So I showed you a local example here of Kerala in India, where a politician there very recently, so I think just last week, posted this tweet. Kerala will eradicate absolute poverty. And he makes a very similar statement to the UN, saying there are going to be a counting of who is in poverty using transparent exclusion criteria. I'm not sure if it's the $1.25 a day criteria or some other one that they have in mind there in Kerala, but something. And then they will prepare to meet, bring everyone above that line. So the point here is simply that, yes, there's a global goal, but there are also people in the world, and this politician, Thomas Isaac from the local Communist Party there in Kerala is one, are also focusing locally on something quite similar. You can ask yourself whether we'll succeed globally, whether we'll succeed locally. Let's go on to the next slide. So at least in terms of globally, what's happened since 2015? In 2020, global extreme poverty went up. So that green, that red curve that I showed you dropping rapidly on the first slide started to tick up. So more people were entering poverty globally than the previous year. And that's the first time in a long time that we've had a reversal on progress in poverty. 100 million people added as estimated due to pandemic and climate change. Another 100 million are estimated to be moving into poverty by 2030 by the World Bank due to climate change and its impacts. So at least recently, it appears that the trend downward has reversed itself and more people are living under this nominal poverty indicator. So I'm going to stop here and let the audience have a little bit of thinking on this topic, and we'll see what people think so far. So let's pop up audience poll number 1, and I'll give you a few minutes to contemplate. I'll read out the poll. So the first option, poverty's been going down for many decades, since 1950. You saw it in the slides. There's been a little bit of a reversal, perhaps due to things like pandemic and climate change, but fundamentally, the free market is going to take care of this. Poverty is not something we need to concern ourselves with. Second option, well, these planetary pressures like climate change are actually reversing. That's a substantial change. And we need to focus our energies on things like climate change or pandemics if we want to combat poverty, rather than simply old-fashioned mechanisms in the economic sphere where we think about poverty alleviation, we have to think about combating climate change. And that will have the co-benefit of decreasing poverty. And that's a new approach we have to take because these planetary pressures are new, relatively new. The third option is that this is really a national or a local challenge. Every place is different. Kerala is trying it, obviously, but they have different indicators. They shouldn't be using the $1.25 number because Kerala is different from other places. And really, we should be thinking about these local challenges. How can Kerala eradicate poverty? A global action is not really relevant to people on the ground locally, or not as relevant as a local actions. A fourth option, look, this income is not a good indicator. People have wealth. For example, me, I'm retired. I have very little income, but I have some wealth. So what does it matter that my income is low? And we should be thinking in a different way about different indicators. This one that the UN has decided on is not really very good. And then finally, I like to think that people are probably thinking some other things, that none of this really is what you have to say, and you don't want to tick any of those boxes. You have some other thoughts, so go ahead and tick the last box, that I haven't really laid out enough options or the proper options. So hopefully we've had enough time while I've been reading them for enough people to respond, but I'll wait now a little while. And when the organizers feel we've had a good response, a good percentage of the audience, I hope you can see that, then go ahead and we'll have a look at the results, have a look at what the audience is thinking about these. I will go ahead and submit my answer. So I submitted my thought. You can see from the sunlight, it's early morning here. The sun's just coming up. It's starting to shine in my eyes. I'm in Ottawa, Canada.
I think we can have the results.
Yeah, let's have a look at the results. If you're still thinking, okay. So basically nobody bought the Economist line that private sector will take care of everything. That Economist magazine usually says stuff like that. Quite a few people believe that the planetary pressures are new and important, and combating them is going to be an important task. I chose this one in red, so the majority has sided with me. Really, that a global goal and global tracking on this is not the best way to focus. Really, local considerations are of primary importance. So we need to have local goals and local actions to combat poverty. Nobody felt that this was good to see. I had a good set of questions out there. So that's interesting. It's certainly what I think, that this is a local challenge. It's nice to have a global goal. It's nice to have a global target and to monitor it, but progress is going to depend on local monitoring, local indicators specific to local conditions and local actions. So let's move on. Let's close the poll. Of course, that's not necessarily the truth. That's just my opinion and the opinion of this audience. Let's move on to the next slide. So this is just before I go on to some of the other goals, to remind us all that these goals are linked. I made the case that climate change is linked to poverty. It's driving poverty up. And I just wanted to give an example of air conditioning. Here in Ottawa, in Canada, I'm at 46 degrees north. My air conditioning turned on today at 8 o'clock because the temperature was getting hot and humid. Decreasing poverty is an extremely effective way to adapt to climate change, because when it's hot, if you have money, you can do things like turn on your air conditioning, as I just said I did. And that's so there's a link between adapting to climate change and decreasing poverty. People who are in poverty are much more vulnerable to some of the climate change impacts. At the same time, all this increased wealth bringing people out of poverty is also going to exacerbate climate change. when I turn on my air conditioner, I'm burning fossil fuels, at least to some extent, using energy and causing more fossil fuels to be burned indirectly, even if I have a nuclear power plant or a solar panel or something. So there's a linkage there. And also, importantly, this third point is that decreasing poverty or vulnerability in one segment of a population, either one country or one gender or one economic class, could have unintended consequences on others. And air conditioning is a really good example. Yesterday, I was visiting my father-in-law who's in an assisted living facility because he has limited mobility. And because of COVID, I was standing outside the window and his air conditioner was blasting out really hot air at me, making me really uncomfortable so he could be comfortable in his room. And, that's just a way of seeing it tangibly, but it's true. When one person takes an action to decrease their vulnerability or increase their resilience to climate change, it could have negative impacts or positive impacts on other people. So understanding these linkages is extremely important, not just following one indicator for one goal. Let's go to the next slide. So I said the next topic I'm going to talk about is waste management. I think this is an important one in India. They've had a lot of examples of, for example, fires in the landfills outside of New Delhi not too long ago. So let's look at the targets and the indicators that the UN has agreed. Target 11.6, by 2030, reduce the adverse per capita environmental impact of cities, including, and then I've left some things out, municipal and other waste management. So that's in there as a way of reducing the impact of cities. And the indicator to track progress, proportion of urban solid waste regularly collected and with adequate final discharge by these cities. And target 12.5, by 2030, substantially reduce waste generation through prevention, reduction, recycling, and reuse. So they've selected a number of actions that they suggest to reduce waste. And the indicator they've chosen is national recycling rates, or tons of material that is recycled. You see, I asked you in the bottom there to think a little bit about India specifically, because waste management, like poverty, is a very local thing. Let's move to the next slide. So in order to frame this discussion, I'm going to be talking about this report, which is now a couple of years old, but it was something that I oversaw production of in my Environmental Technology Center, and it's about one technology, waste to energy. So incinerating waste and generating electricity or steam energy. And this report looks at considerations for that technology, thinking about for policymakers at the city level, do they want to invest in an incinerator and will it help them with their problems? Next slide, please. So here's a map of these municipal solid waste incinerators, showing you how many there are in the world and divided by sort of continental region. And of course, the first thing you'll notice is Asia Pacific has the most, but basically there's what I'm showing here, by the way, in green is incineration with energy recovery. So it's the green piece of pie. Dark blue is incineration with no energy recovery, just burn it and reduce its volume that way. That's still quite dominant. And you can see, and then there are some other, landfill and waste unaccounted for and so forth. There's a big difference between developed countries, which do a lot of incineration, rich countries in North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific, and less developed countries in Africa, West Asia, Latin America, where they do very little. Next slide, please. So the top 10 or so countries, as I said, they're all rich, very rich countries. They're all in the top, probably in the top 10 per capita income that are using this technology. This is showing you, for example, let's take Japan. Japan incinerates 30 million tons of waste per year in 754 plants across the country of Japan. And you can see the numbers for many of these other countries. The most quickly changing numbers are in China. where on this we show a rather small number, 5 million tons in 286 plants. That number is very rapidly rising. Next slide, please. So you saw in those last few slides that there's a pretty strong difference between developing and developed countries in this use of this technology. In Africa and Latin America, most waste is not collected. It's dumped either in the open or in informal dumps. Of the waste that is collected, 90% of it is disposed in open dumps in landfills. So even if it's collected, it's not being properly, or it's not being dealt with in a way that's environmentally and health and for human health sound. It's just being sort of dumped somewhere. And on the other side of the coin, 80% of the thermal waste to energy plants that are being deployed are in developed countries led by the most wealthy countries, basically. So why is it? Why is there this difference, and how can developing countries think about the challenge and whether they want to adopt this technology or not? Let's have a look at the next slide. So this is a map that shows you the content of waste. There are three axes. The bottom shows you the combustible fraction, the percentage of waste being generated in a country which is burnable. There are some things that can't burn and generate any energy. The right-hand axis shows you the water content. How wet is the waste? Because it's harder to burn wet waste than dry waste. And then the non-combustible fraction on the left. This light blue zone there is where a modern municipal incinerator will work efficiently. And most developed countries sit around in this yellow circle right smack in the middle. So their waste content is ideally suited for this technology. On the other hand, developing countries are off to the side in those. There are two examples. India is one of them. The Philippines is another. You can see they're right on the edge. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But the waste content is an important variable that countries such as India and the Philippines would have to consider when they're considering this technology. And you see my thinking exercise gives you a little bit of an answer. How important is it to separate organic compostable waste? Compostable waste is very wet and very easy to deal with in other ways. So if you're separating it, your waste stream becomes much more amenable to this technology. Next slide, please. Another issue is cost. You can see it says here over the lifetime of a plant, we estimate that a 40-year lifetime, the average cost of one of these things, it's about $1 billion. So that's a lot of money. The initial supply and construction isn't so much, and that's shown in purple, maybe only $150 million. Okay, it's still quite a bit. You got to have $150 million, but it's perhaps achievable, and I'll show you it is achievable in India because many have been built. Operation and maintenance is an extremely costly consideration. If the plant is not operated and maintained properly, it won't work properly. So that's a real cost, and there has to be revenue generated in order to cover these costs. And finally, I should point out that nobody, even in the developed world, has thought about the question of what is the cost of shutting down one of these plants? We couldn't even find the numbers. When it's come to the end of its operational life, how do you properly get rid of that waste, the plant itself? And we don't have good numbers on how much that costs. Next slide, please. So here's one of the figures from that report, which shows you capital cost in millions of dollars on the vertical axis and capacity in tons per day on the right. And as sort of a curve, you can see that larger capacity plants are more expensive, that some of the largest capacity plants in the world are relatively new ones built in Singapore and Dubai. Very expensive plant built in Hong Kong, way outside this line. You can see two in India there. Jabalpur, I'm reticent to even try to say these names, but Timarpur and Jabalpur, India plants very cheap. So they were built with very little capital cost. We'll go into that a little bit later. Next slide, please. Of course, if you have a plant like this, one of the concerns is emissions, and there are emissions from plants. You know, if you have a plant that is not carefully removing them, there can be very dangerous cancer-causing emissions, specifically or especially from plastics. So countries have developed standards, and India, you know, so one of the constraints is a legal framework with standards for emissions, which you can use to police these plants. And India has done well with that. There is a national standard, and it's similar. You can see in some cases even more stringent than those in China or the EU, but similar. So India has a good, I would say, a good national legal framework for emission standards. Next slide, please. So this is a box from the report. It's hard to read because it's just copied right out of the report, but it's an example from the Oklah waste energy plant in India where those standards came into play. So the plant was commissioned in 2012. There was an outcry about dioxins, which are released from burning plastic. There were in place legal standards, so there was a protest. And some monitoring was done to check. In the end, on this particular case, the plant was allowed to continue operations. It was determined that it was not emitting and paid some small fines. I would point that out only that I would say that the legal constraints in India to some extent work. I mean, there was enough to temporarily close this plant, but this is a challenge that is not fixed in 1 year. The plant will continue operating for 40 years, and you have to continually monitor the emissions and continually check on plant emissions. You can't just say, oh, we passed in 2012, we're finished, because these things can change. Next slide, please. So this is just another table from the report looking at 3 plants in India and that had closed and why they closed. So lack of due diligence by the investor or the private sector was certainly part of that. The waste quality, which I mentioned in the beginning, so the ability of the local municipality to separate out compostable wet waste, for example, and divert more burnable waste to the plant was a problem. So that's sort of similar to the next one, the putting too many non-burnable items into the waste stream. In the one case, there was public outcry, public resistance that was very important, in the others not. And then in the one case, the money was an issue, that there was a lack of financial viability, so not enough income for the plant to continue operations. So those are sort of 3 examples of the local constraints on this technology in India. Next slide, please. So this is just another story from India for this Jabalpur plant, which the upshot is that it's a public-private partnership. So there's both public investment and public support for the plant. Often that comes in the way of guaranteeing for the private sector partner that's building the plant and investing in it, guaranteeing certain things, such as a waste stream, so many tons of waste per day of a certain quality, or a feed-in tariff. When they generate electricity, it will be, the government will pay them so many dollars per kilowatt hour for the electricity. So I don't want to talk too much about that one. That's just an example of how a plant is being operated in India. Next slide, please. So to conclude, when you're thinking about this technology in a developing country, waste characteristics are important. Do you have a separation scheme in place? Can you guarantee appropriate waste that will allow the plant to work? Economic aspects are super important, and it's not just a capital cost to build the plant, but very much the running costs that are important, and the costs of maintaining a emissions-free plant. The legal aspects, I think I showed one slide. India has a nationally approved emission standard, and there have been examples of people using that standard to challenge plants, so that's kind of good. Environmental aspects, the pollution, of course, people's health impacted in that way. And then, of course, the social impact. Often case, public outcry will be so large that you can't maintain a plant, even if all the other ones are covered. So those are the kinds of considerations that we talk about in this report. And for more detail, I encourage you to download it from the web. Next slide, please. So to conclude on waste management, this waste energy technology is mainstream and a dominant part of the waste stream in many developed countries, certainly Japan. I show you here a satellite image of Osaka Bay, where I used to live, and you can see that the entire coast is square islands. Obviously, those are not natural. All of those islands have been built with incinerator ash. So they're using the ash from the incinerators to build artificial islands. One of them is the international airport at the bottom there. That's the Kansai International Airport. So I would say in Osaka, for example, they don't separate compostable organics. They have such a good system, and they've built so many of these plants that there is an incentive for more garbage, because the local government has promised all the plant operators lots of trash to burn. And so their people are separating out plastics and separating out this and that, but it's all going to these incinerators. So there's kind of some perverse incentives to increase the amount of trash and have more wrapping, because the plant, you got to feed these beasts. At the same time, waste to energy solutions are practically non-existent in the developing world. There are a few in India, but not many, and many have been shut down. Often that's lack of technology, funding, collection and separation culture, or poor regulation. Let's have a look at poll number 2 to conclude sort of my statements on waste management. So the first one, waste to energy, well, excellent solution. Japan is doing a great job. And it's an excellent solution globally. And India has some substantial and urgent waste management challenges, including this one. And India should accelerate and adopt waste to energy technologies to solve its waste management challenges in the same way that developed countries have been doing for decades, and accelerate the production of these plants. Second one, no, waste energy is not part of sustainable development. It creates incentives to produce more waste. It's the opposite of reduce, reuse, recycle. It's not an appropriate sustainable development technology. It's a wasteful technology. India should not be going down this route. The third one is, well, it's different from place to place, maybe even city to city. And in some cases, waste to energy technologies are appropriate, given all those constraints I talked about, and can be adopted safely and be an appropriate part of the local sustainable development trajectory. In other places, it's not appropriate and it's just not going to work. Or, well, none of those things really are what you think we should be saying. Just click none of the above. They don't capture your thoughts on waste management. I thought I had another slide on waste management talking about reduce, reuse, recycle. Maybe it's after this. So I won't talk about it quite yet, but call me on that if I don't get back to the reduce, reuse, recycle and that indicator. Maybe I'll just say it while we're waiting for the poll. The indicator that the UN has adopted is % of recycled material. So that's not monitoring reduction. It's only monitoring recycling. You could increase your waste streams dramatically, or your per capita waste streams, and recycle more, and the UN indicator would show progress on reduce, reuse, recycle, because you're recycling more of it. So that's just a point I wanted to raise, that these indicators are themselves a little bit questionable at times. If you have a goal which is reduce, reuse, recycle, and you only track the least important one, recycling, you're not really monitoring reduction or reuse. So hopefully we've had enough time. We can have a look at people's thoughts. Okay, the majority, again, as with the last one, and again, this is my opinion, yes, it's appropriate in some places. It's very dangerous to say it's appropriate in rich countries and it's not appropriate in poor countries because, that's just unfair, unequitable solution finding. But it's certainly true that sometimes you can get these to work and sometimes you can't, and the constraints are laid out clearly. And one of them is financial. Technology is one, but it seems pretty clear that majority of people think this is a geographical issue. I believe that India can adopt this technology in some cities. It requires, you've got the legal constraints pretty well covered with good emissions control limits and good mechanisms for public response. China doesn't have some of those things. They have the emissions limits, but it's a little unclear they have the good legal system to ensure they're kept in place. Anyway, it's an interesting technology. I don't support it, but I'm certainly also not against it. I think it's appropriate in some contexts. So let's close this poll and move on to the next slide. Okay, so climate change. I'm going to talk about a couple of things in climate change. I'll try to speed up oh no, we got a little time. Adaptation, so adjusting to these new climatic conditions. The target that the UN has agreed is strengthen resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards and natural disasters in all countries. And the indicator they've chosen to measure progress, number of deaths, missing persons, and directly affected persons attributed to disasters per population, per 100,000. So next slide, please. Let's have a little bit of a look at some adaptation. So here's two examples from the United States, both tropical cyclones or hurricanes, as they're called in North America. 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. It caused 1,800 deaths, $125 billion in damage. Largely that damage and those deaths were because the levees failed. So not necessarily because of the size of the storm, but because the infrastructure that had been developed to prevent flooding failed. 2012, Hurricane Sandy, very similar size of storm, hit a big city, even bigger city, New York. Indeed, it hit many cities across the Caribbean, even up into Canada here. Killed only 233 people and 70 billion in damage. But you will perhaps recall that New York City was hammered pretty hard. All the subways were flooded, power was out, and there were, knock-on effects in New York that were quite substantial. I ask here well, one thing is you can look at the numbers. One had much lower deaths than the other. Does that mean that between 2005 and 2012, the United States improved its resilience as measured by this indicator? That's the agreed indicator, number of deaths per event. I would say it's pretty obvious that the answer is no. This was the death rate was driven by something very specific in New Orleans, not some kind of national policy or national resilience number. But it is interesting to compare the cities and ask which showed greater resilience. If you look at something like, it's not the agreed indicator, but choose another one, the economy or the population of the city. After Hurricane Katrina, the population and economy of New Orleans dropped substantially. If you look today, it's still not back. It has not come back to the pre-Katrina levels of population and economy. So you could say it wasn't very resilient. It still hasn't bounced back, 15 years later. Whereas with New York, basically no impact. 1 year later, population and economy showed no discernible impact from Hurricane Sandy. So bounced back, very resilient. Next slide, please. Okay, another very recent event. This is still ongoing, in fact, but on the 29th of June, Lytton, Canada, I'm here in Canada, reported a temperature of 49.6 degrees Celsius. That is a temperature at which humans cannot sustainably survive. So if that temperature were the only temperature we had and we had no air conditioning, our bodies biologically would be unable to cool ourselves fast enough to survive at that temperature. So it's above our tolerance as a long-term temperature. Very hot. Next slide, please. So this is what happened. I'm not going to show you the video, but there's a link there. This was the evacuation. There was no warning. There was no information for local people. This person who is interviewed decided to leave because his cell phone signal stopped working and he thought it must be an emergency. He didn't know where to go. He had to abandon one of his pets to the fires. He drove in some places it seemed to be getting worse. And basically it was a complete disaster. The predictable fire that resulted from the temperature, it was just a couple days later that the burning started. Next slide, please. And just so you don't think this is something special about Lytton, Canada, here's a picture of Portland, Oregon, showing you the temperature low in the winter, high in the summers, many, many years of data giving you sort of a envelope of variability in gray. And this year, you see on that same weekend, this one in Fahrenheit, Saturday and Sunday and Monday, way outside the pressed envelope of heat, 116 degrees Fahrenheit. When I put this slide on, there had been no fire yet, but as you might predict, because of this heat, next slide, please. There was a fire. In fact, it's one of the largest fires in the West right now, this bootleg fire just outside of Portland, Oregon. And you can see there, in fact, all over that region of extreme heat. Right now, it's still burning in many areas. Air quality has been affected across the entire continent. And there are many impacts of these fires which are related to climate change. Next slide, please. Of course, I don't know if India has experienced fires recently, maybe so, but certainly flooding has been causing deaths. That I showed you the number of deaths per 100,000 is the real indicator of these climate disasters. There's a number. There's an event which was just in July, late July of this year in India. I wrote down in the thinking exercise, will India count them when it reports on SDG 13 progress, indicator 13.1.1? Is the Modi government going to say 130 deaths related to climate change disaster in this region and report it back to the UN as for their accounting of progress on this indicator? Similarly, is Canada going to report the deaths or the economic damage, or is the United States going to report? And there, I think you probably know the answer is probably not. They're probably not going to say, this is definitely a climate change event. These deaths are related to climate change. We're going to report it to the Climate Change Convention as a climate death. So that's just to show you that it's one thing to set these indicators and set these targets quantifiable. Even if they're not perfect, they exist. And it's another thing to get countries to report them so that we can have a really good sense of progress or lack of progress on that indicator. Next slide, please. So mitigation is another, I'm going to talk about three aspects of climate change. Adaptation, we just did. Mitigation, I'll cover now, and then a little bit about finance. So mitigation, meaning reducing the magnitude, reducing the amount of climate change. The target there is integrate climate change measures into national policies, strategies, and planning. The indicator is such a word soup, I couldn't fit it on a slide, which is already a problem. So you see a lot of ellipses where I've dropped words, but fundamentally it says the number of countries that have communicated to the UN a plan which increases their ability to foster low greenhouse gas emissions and doesn't threaten food production. And I've dropped a lot of words. So, well, I ask you to think a little bit about that indicator and how relevant or useful it is as a measure of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. Why not, for example, greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere? That would be a pretty good indicator. Are they going up or down? So let's go on to the next slide, talk a little bit about mitigation. So, well, there is another indicator. It's agreed by the, not by the UN Sustainable Development Statistical Commissions, but by the UNFCCC, the Convention on Climate Change. And that is pretty clear. Keep global temperature rise below 2 degrees C. And they have stated that to do so requires we achieve net zero emissions by, they're a little hazy on that, 2030, 2050. And many countries have stated they will do that. In fact, the majority of the emitters in the world have made a pledge to achieve net zero emissions. That includes the European Union, includes many big companies. I call out Microsoft here. Microsoft has pledged by 2030, it will have net zero emissions. By 2050, it will account for all of its historical emissions since the beginning of Microsoft and remove all that CO2 from the atmosphere. That's the pledge from Microsoft. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, this is funding. Okay, we'll get back in the questioning, maybe to mitigation. Let's move on to this funding question. So climate action requires money. As everybody knows, the majority of the greenhouse gas emissions that have occurred have been put in the atmosphere by developed countries, by the richest countries, or the ones that were rich early on in the use of fossil fuels. Currently, the #1 emitter is China by a lot. So how are we going to, but yet the problems are often largest in less developed countries, in developing countries, and require money. So what is the agreement on financial issues? Target 13.A is mobilizing jointly $100 billion annually by 2020 to address the needs of developing countries. Very clear statement of need, and a very clear indicator. How much money was mobilized between 2020 and 2025 towards the 100 billion commitment? Now notice that in the indicator, they dropped the per year. That's kind of important. The commitment is not $100 billion, it's $100 billion per year. So maybe it's thought to be implicit in the indicator, but I think that's a big lacuna in the wording. So the Green Climate Fund was set up. That's probably the largest source of funds that was made after these kind of commitments. Had a capitalization request of 100 billion per year. It received $10 billion total. That's the total amount of money it's received to date. So nowhere close to this indicator. Of course, that's not all of the funding that's being made available. Much funding is bilateral, but anyway, it's so far from the 100 billion number that we can forget we're even close. Now, maybe that's a lot of money. Let's not go quite yet to the next slide. Let's stay on this slide for just a minute, if you can back up. I just wanted to compare it with COVID-19. The US gave $3 billion to the Green Climate Fund under Obama, or they pledged $3 billion. I'm not sure they've given it all. How much did they provide for themselves to deal with the COVID-19 crisis? And there the answer is well above $1 trillion. It's many trillions of dollars. And globally, countries have spent tens of trillions of dollars combating COVID-19. So $10 trillion is, $100 billion per year for 100 years. So it's not the case that $100 billion per year is so much money that nobody can produce it, because we produced it globally for COVID. And arguably the COVID impacts are less than the climate change impacts. People can think about that a little bit, but why are we only able to produce $10 billion of funding for climate change impacts and easily trillions, tens of trillions for COVID? Next slide, please. Okay, a little bit about offsets. I said everybody's pledging net zero. How do you pledge net zero? It's you pledge to reduce your emissions of fossil fuels, but then not to zero, and account for any remaining emissions that you will have by sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. That's called offsets. And one of the most popular, or almost all of these offsets, are things that do not take CO2 out of the atmosphere. I give an example here of planting trees. That's a very popular one. Trees indeed are carbon sinks when they're growing. But if you plant a tree, the only way it's an offset is if that tree stays in the ground for all its life, and then the CO2 at the end of its life, it doesn't have any pathway back into the atmosphere. Pathways back in the atmosphere are burning, rotting, in fact, anything that happens to that tree, the carbon dioxide is going to go back in the atmosphere. So the only way to have a sustainable sink is to maintain the forest where that tree was planted for all eternity. Now, if you put a little money into an offset to plant a tree, you can ask the question, well, all the money went to planting the tree and you claim the offset. What about the actions that are required for the rest of eternity to maintain the forest? Those are large. It's just like the cost of a waste to energy plant. The initial cost is low. The lifetime cost is high. And here's just an example from my local paper in Vermont. My parents live in Vermont, of a guy who found a telephone pole made out of wood that had fallen over and been replaced by a concrete one. And he went out and cut it up, and he's going to burn it to warm his house. So there's an example of the end use of trees. I mean, it gets turned into a telephone pole. The telephone pole falls over. This guy cuts it up. He burns it. Carbon back in the atmosphere. So I would be very careful with this offsets for net zero pledges. They almost all are not going to work. Next slide, please. So poll on climate. Let's pull up the poll. And while we're pulling it up, I'll just conclude adaptation is very local. Adaptation challenges overcoming includes having wealth, building resilience, but there's not a global strategy. Mitigation is a global problem. Every country is emitting. We need to have global agreement on emissions reductions or it won't work. So those are quite different challenges. All right, the poll. Climate change priority for India, what is it? Prime Minister Modi has made a pledge. I'll read it to you. Cut greenhouse gas emissions intensity of its GDP 33% to 35% by 2030. So in other words, Modi has said that India wishes to continue growing its gross domestic product, but it will do so with a reduced use per percent growth of the economy, a reduced use of carbon. So it's not a reduction in carbon emissions. The carbon emissions can still go up, but they'll go up less quickly as a percent of economic growth. Increase non-fossil fuel capacity by 40% from the current 28%. Now that's a question you can immediately ask the question, okay, you increase your non-fossil fuel power generation, but if demand goes up, that's also not going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And if the economy is growing, demand will go up. And finally, boost forest cover to reduce CO2. I just told you, boosting forest cover will not reduce CO2. If you boost the forest cover and you maintain the forest for all eternity, then you have some reduction, but it's very difficult to claim it in the short term. But anyhow, that's the pledge. It's probably it's a compromise, but India should take actions to try and meet this pledge. Second option, India should prioritize resilience building and disaster risk adaptation. India is at risk. It should request funding from developed countries, the Green Climate Fund, and prioritize adapting to climate change, reducing the number of deaths and economic destruction associated with extreme events and climate change. Third option, India has a long experience with disasters. The monsoon's been happening for many millions of years. India's priority should be sharing its experience with less developed countries, helping other countries to adapt. I think, by the way, you can choose multiple buttons, at least I hope so. Or at least the bottom one is that all of these things. India should prioritize everything. It should prioritize meeting Modi's pledge. Prime Minister Modi's pledge. It should prioritize building resilience, and it should prioritize sharing its experience with other countries. Now here, because that seems kind of obvious, I put in a caveat at the expense of other things, because you can't do everything. So, what are some other priorities? The economic growth that Prime Minister Modi talks about, maybe that has to decrease, or defense and security, or daycare for working mothers, or Social Security. So the fourth one is supposed to be a little bit difficult, because you're saying prioritize these climate goals at the expense of other priorities for society. And then the last one, I can't quite see it, but I'm sure it says that these top four don't meet your expectations, and you don't choose any of them. So I'm going to submit mine. I give you a chance to think a little bit about those options and vote. So I'm just, while we wait, thinking a little bit about these challenges. As I said, adaptation is really up. You saw the difference between New Orleans and New York, for example. Even within a single country, adaptation challenges at the city level are very different. Mitigation is a big global challenge. These net zero emission pledges that have been made are, of course, great, but evidence that they're achievable, or even on anyone's taking any actions to achieve them, is weak. And offsets are a very dangerous tool, because mostly they don't work, or there's no reason to believe they will work. Okay, let's maybe have a look. Okay, so interesting, a little bit more balanced than some of the previous polls. I said, so this is the first time I've disagreed with the majority of you. I said India should prioritize resilience and reducing disaster risk. That really, as a national challenge, disaster risk is a big one for India. There are probably fairly low-hanging fruit in terms of how to build resilience to issues like the flooding last month, and that should be the priority for India. The majority of you chose my fourth option, which is a good option. I'd almost choose that, but whenever you say too many things, then you lose focus on your first priority. So personally, I think I voted for number 2, but I'm glad to see that people believe climate change is a real problem, and that India should be working on several aspects, not only its own resilience, but helping other countries, and also participating in the mitigation response. So let's close that and go to the next slide. I've been going for a little over, or about an hour, so I'm going to try and come to some conclusions. Take-home messages. Okay, these SDGs, I think ending poverty everywhere in all its forms by 2030, we can all agree is not going to happen. It's unachievable. So headlines saying we did not achieve SDG 1 are not very useful. Probably a better way of thinking about SDGs is monitoring them with these indicators or other methods, and adjusting what we're doing to better track progress towards these nominal goals. One thing that a lot of companies and countries are doing is mapping exercises. What are we doing that is contributing to SDGs? And then they say, we're doing X, Y, and Z, and it contributes to SDGs, 1, 5, and 7. That's not very helpful either, because you're doing it anyway. You were contributing to the SDGs. If the indicators work, it'll be tracked. Making PowerPoint slides showing how you're contributing to them with your already existing activities is not, well, it's something new, but it's not making more progress. And yet a lot of countries, a lot of companies are doing exactly that. More interesting would be, now that we have these SDGs, how have you changed your behavior as a company, as an individual, as a country to better make progress towards these goals? 0 is a really popular number. For some reason, politicians and others love to say, oh, I have 0 tolerance for whatever. We're going to have 0 waste. We're going to have net 0 emissions. My opinion is that 0 number is a bad one. It sounds good. It might get you some votes or something, but actually it's not a good target. If you're trying to achieve 0 waste, you wind up taking so much effort to get the last little bit of waste gone. Like, we got to remove the plastic from IV bottles in emergency room hospitals. It's going to be a waste. No, I think we should keep those IV plastic bottles because they're important for emergency situations, and we should not be achieving 0 waste. We should be decreasing our waste. We should be reducing our waste. And so often I think this 0 target is, okay, people say it, but it's not an important target. It's much more important to reduce and have everybody reduce than one person achieve 0. For example, veganism. Veganism, 0 eating of meat of any kind. Sure, fine. If people want to be vegan, that's fine, but it's not a solution to global climate change because some people will fail. I mean, veganism is difficult for some people. Rather, just reduce your meat intake dramatically and have everybody do that. And it's easier target and is much better than trying to get everybody to 0. And then the linkage of the SDGs. I talked about that a bit. I won't go back into it, but it's really important not to get sidetracked into just thinking about one goal and then one indicator on it and thinking all the impacts of what you're doing are on that indicator and that goal, because they're not. Sometimes the biggest impacts can be in some other goal. Next slide, please. Okay, my final slide, or my second to last slide, my penultimate slide. This is, and what I've been talking about is not new. I got a quote here from Boethius, a Roman senator in the year somewhere in around the year 500. He wrote his book, Consolation of Philosophy. So that's 1,500 years ago. And his quote was, "Let us try to quantify, if possible, what is important, rather than deem that which has been quantified as that which is important." So I think that maybe sums up some of my thinking or what I've been talking about these indicators. They're valuable, they're important, they monitor progress, but let's not be fooled into thinking because we can measure something, that's the important thing. And that's maybe, my example might have been the recycling indicator. Sorry, I don't know how to turn off my phone. Next slide, please. Okay, that's it. This is a picture of a boat made out of old flip-flops sailing in a sea of waste plastic bottles for the United Nations Environment Program's 4th International Congress. The flags of many of or all of the countries who participate in UN activities trying to contribute to these sustainable development goals. You see here my email, my LinkedIn, my Twitter account. If people want to follow up, well, we have a question and answer session now, but I'm happy to continue to interact with any of the audience who are interested by these other means. So thank you very much for your time. Sorry for going a little long. The next slides are just there in as background in case questions arise. So we don't need to go to the next slides. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. So wonderful and so many pertinent questions you have raised. And I'm sure this has raised, we have been thinking about it, and I would not waste further time. And I would invite Dr. Rema Saraswathy for her remarks on your lecture. Ma'am, over to you. Dr. Rema.
Good evening once again to everyone. Well, it was a very enriching, information-packed piece of paper, sir. We got a lot of insight from this paper, but I mean, very, very, very pertinent in this context of, many unprecedented events, uncertain events, and with a lot of regional diversity which we have to cover. When you have to take into consideration all these aspects, talking about the SDGs itself is a difficult challenge. And you have taken very, very important, just 3-4 targets, and you have covered only 5 or 6 indicators, but there are mind-boggling 232 indicators, which even, I don't think even I would have delved into all that because it's such a, whether the indicator is important or is it the development is important. That is sometimes which I think, should we work for the indicator or should we work for the development? Well, as but one main point what Dr. Keith has brought out is that SDGs are necessary, but we should use it mainly for monitoring and adjusting, to see how the progress is in the development taking place. I do agree with that. Well, there are few, I don't know whether we have enough time for all the questions. Well, many of these things like waste management, which I mean, well, my experience is from the local, individual level and community level initiatives. So what I think is, how do we link these things with the individual behaviors? Because what I say is the individual behavior is very important to bring the change or even to reach the sustainable development. Individual behavior change. When we say individual behavior change, from individual we can even go to the local level, local governance body, or even the subnational level. So how do we bring in those indicators into the I mean, I think that is an important aspect we have to consider. Then well, I have my thing. Of course, wherever I pick up the local intervention and the need for the local, I mean, how do we bring in that into the indicators? That was my question in this. Otherwise, it was very mind-boggling thing, and it's very, very interesting presentation. It's keep you awake with all the interesting polls. That was very interesting, like which made us think, and we had to contribute. Well, I'll come back with something else if I have later. I'll give it over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Rema. I would now invite Dr. Ram Boojh for his remarks.
Yes, I think it was very comprehensive, and thanks, Dr. Keith, to touch this very interesting topic. In fact, we had last year a huge debate on this, of course, within the UN system, as we completed 5 years of the SDGs, adoption of the SDGs. And of course, most of the goals have not been even, I would say, they have been not even been touched, as you said, to begin with the climate fund. Instead of 100 billion, only 10 billion is mobilized. I think your conclusion, first you began with the SMART, the goal setting, and of course, development of indicators. Of course, they were not done very smartly in certain way because maybe of the global nature. But one thing is there when we talk about those 3 principles on which, rather I would say initially all those pillars, people, planet, prosperity, peace, and all those, and plus the universality of these goals, because it should have the universal application, then integration. You rightly said that there is interconnectedness. Many of the goals, they are interconnected and overlapping as well. Climate change is one which overlaps through almost all goals. Similarly, education is also overlapping, and the thread is across all the goals. The other thing is with the COVID. In fact, 2019, when COVID was not there, was very momentous year, because the climate change COP that happened, Secretary General said that we are totally disappointed, but have not lost hope. And let us make 2020 as the year of hope, or the super year for environment. But COVID upturned everything. In fact, in the January month, when World Economic Forum met, among the top priorities, all were environmental. Of course, climate, disasters, biodiversity, water, these all were environmental, and they were the top rather risks to the world economy. But now, as you said, we need to rather relook at the goals. Can we have another goal about these pandemics? Similarly, actually, at Mobius, earlier I was with UNESCO and also with UNEP. But one area which is very much untouched is the population stabilization, because we are through the population, which I think everybody has forgotten, and there is no goal for population. So I think when we revisit these, we need to have a specific goal. If we want these sustainable development goals, or the sustainable development achievable or smart. So there are several questions, and I think you have very rightly touched upon them. Poverty alleviation, I think, is very, very important. Yesterday, we had the International Day of World's Indigenous People, and I was in an international webinar. And these are the people, as you very clearly said, that of course we had certain success in poverty alleviation, but during the COVID, because of the COVID, and of course climate change will always impact, rather very disproportionately impact, the poor, disadvantaged, and these indigenous people who have wealth of traditional knowledge, the indigenous knowledge, as you said, for all the solutions, including the food, the waste, the recycling, and of course, climate adaptation. So this report, which was simultaneously released, and Secretary General said that this is a code red for humanity. And of course, it's alarm bells that are ringing. And we have just, because if we want 1.5 degrees as a goal as per the Paris Agreement, we have already reached almost 1.1, and we have just 0.4%, you can say, development space. And then this net zero by 2050. But before that, yesterday, if you carefully watch the Secretary General's statement, that world should have not commissioned any new coal plant during 2021. So after 2021, so 2021, next 3-4 months are the red line. And particularly G20 countries must phase out existing coal plants by 2030, in next 9 years. Of course, all others to follow by 2040, 10 years grace period is there. And further, because a few countries have gone for the net zero, but what are the implications for afforestation? And of course, the trade-offs, as you said, and if what you keep on emitting, but you create the sink or buy the sinks. So that's also very, very questionable. So a lot of questions in achieving target 3, target 1, And waste management, of course, means I think these very nice surveys that you just presented, that says a lot. I think there is not much time to debate on those. The only thing I would say that localization of SDGs, if we localize, that is the only way to achieve it locally. Maybe, of course, Kerala, you gave the example, but in the waste management, I would say one example is Kolkata wetlands. That's an example where the wastewater, solid waste, all are in that small piece of the area, the East Kolkata, these wetlands, they are managed through those what we call a nature-based solutions. There is productive agriculture, productive fisheries, very efficient waste management with very little cost or almost no cost based on the nature. So these kind of nature-based and localized solutions could, I think, make a headway or could find smart solutions to achieve sustainable development goals, and also, of course, the smart climate solutions we can find out. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ram Boojh. Dr. Keith, would you like to respond to what our panelists have to say? And then we can take the questions.
Yeah, just very briefly, excellent points. On Dr. Rema's point about individual behavior, yes, it's a big part of the picture. There have been examples where that's been abused. In the United States, there was a big campaign against littering, implying that plastic in the environment was the problem of individual behavior, and no pressure on companies to stop putting their products in plastic bottles or plastic bags. So, and no matter how much you control littering, this huge flux of products still leads to a problem. So yes, individual behavior is super important. What kind of behavior, separating garbage, for example, is super important. But it comes in together with corporate behavior and government behavior and everything else. It's part of the picture, yes. For Dr. Ram, yeah, those are great points. Population is often ignored, and yet it's super important. I mean, the easiest way to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions is to reduce our populations. So ignoring it is not appropriate. Great point on nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions are really useful. They're cheap, they're efficient, they have co-benefits. They're not always the solution. Like New Delhi has a waste management challenge with all these giant mounds of waste, and it's unlikely that a simple nature-based solution would be sufficient for a huge metropolitan area. So some kind of balance of nature-based solutions where they work well and more engineered solutions is obviously best. But whenever possible, nature-based solutions are really good. I agree. So those are my thoughts. Obviously, we don't have much time for much discussion. There's a lot of topics, but thank you for the great feedback from the panelists.
Thank you so much, sir. So I would now point out to a question that has been raised by an anonymous attendee about what is your perspective on eco-fascism and the narrative of an individual being able to make a difference by making sustainable choices. Are there aspects in which that might actually add up and work, such as waste segregation, and what about other alternatives such as paper straws and cloth bags? Can they make a dent at all if corporates don't take their accountability? So this is quite a deep question, but what are your views about it?
Yeah, certainly I agree with the concept that small solutions adopted by individuals, it's often difficult to see a path to them making a difference. Giving up on plastic straws will get rid of 0.001% of our plastic use. So you can say, well, straws don't matter. They're a very small contribution. That problem always nags at us. I agree with the questioner's implication that it's not only individual behavior. So individuals can change our behavior. I certainly don't use plastic straws. I've made that choice. But I also feel that part of my individual responsibility is not just changing my behavior, but trying to encourage governments and companies to change their behavior. So my individual actions are not just about my own use of plastic or my own greenhouse gas emissions, but also on trying to push companies and governments to do the same. And it's through all of these links that we can make progress on many of these sustainable development goals. I'm not sure what eco-fascism is, but I'm really opposed to this guilting people into doing things, and especially very difficult things. I don't think it works. Negative feedback and making people feel guilty about eating meat is not a solution. Encouraging people to eat less meat because it's good, but allowing them the pleasure of eating some meat is a much more, I apologize for the vegetarians out there. I'm happy if you're a complete vegetarian, but since not everybody can do it, trying to get to that 0 is not an appealing goal. Rather, getting everybody to get to 90% reduction is a much more appealing goal. So I think that's the eco-fascism idea, you can't do this, you can't do that, is a bad way forward for really getting tractable progress.
Right. Thank you, sir. So actually, there are quite a few young participants in the audience. What would be your suggestions for them, since when you talk about individual responsibility and then vis-a-vis the corporates and the government's responsibility, how can they contribute towards achieving sustainable development?
Well, new ideas, new thinking, new energy. Young people are, unfortunately, I mentioned that in terms of the climate change problem, a lot of the problem has been built by countries that developed earlier, and a lot of the impacts are on developing countries now. The same thing is true in the age. Those of us who grew up some time ago, we didn't even know about climate change when I was growing up. I burnt as much fossil fuel as I wanted, totally ignorant of the possibility that it was changing the climate, have caused problems for the younger generations, and the younger generations are really going to bear the brunt of those problems. So I think I'd like to listen to the younger generations and hear what their perspectives are, not just tell them what I think they should do. But if I were giving some advice, I hope they come up with better development pathways than my generation came up with. My generation was very focused on GDP growth, exponential growth in economy, on income, with very little priority on wealth. That means our natural wealth, our environmental capital, our social wealth, how educated our societies are, and our financial wealth. If we have less debt and more national wealth, we can build more resilient societies. But all aspects of wealth. And I think focusing on that kind of social, environmental, and financial capital wealth, rather than just income growth, is probably one of the ways that we could find more, the new generation can think differently about development challenges.
Right. So we have COP26 happening this year, and we've, as you started the lecture by the IPCC sixth assessment report, the first report, and you highlighted how it is not very different from the fifth assessment report. So do you think that it came at the right time, and the entire narrative that was going to happen or take place in November might change, and things will be different, and more affirmations will be made, and more countries will make more and more commitments towards climate change, towards combating climate change?
Well, I like to say I hope so, but fundamentally no. I don't think IPCC 6, I mean, we've only seen the first part, the physical basis. There's still 2 parts to come. But I don't think that there are 2 things that are not changing quickly. The climate changes slowly. That's the definition of climate. It's a 50-year average of weather or something like that. So climate is changing, hasn't changed much between 2014 and today. And also the knowledge about the climate system hasn't changed much. So the difference between the IPCC 6 and IPCC 5 is small. I mean, they've narrowed the, they've said instead of between 1.5 and 4.5 change, it'll be between 2.5 and 4. And I'm not even sure how they came up with that, but okay, it's a little smaller window. There are little changes, but why those changes would trigger a big change in of what countries are doing is not clear to me. So I don't think it will, I regret to say. And also, given we're coming to the 26th COP, I think 26 is a pretty big number. And people like Greta Thunberg, you mentioned youth, have called them out on this. I mean, we've been talking, so is Donald Trump. I mean, both ends of the spectrum have said, wait a minute, this is a talk shop, not an action shop. So I don't want to be too pessimistic, but at the same time, I don't want to give a false perception that because we have a new IPCC and we're going to have a 26th COP, that we can forget about this problem. It's all going to be solved. No, it's going to take a lot more than that. It's going to take individual behavior change, corporate behavior change, and these pledges for net zero have to be made, I think, differently. Instead of net zero, which is relying on these very dubious offsets, just pledging reductions is, more tractable and achievable. So I spoke a little bit about that, but I don't see a silver bullet out there. We had a new IPCC. We're going to have a 26 COP. Everything's solved. No, I don't think that.
Sure. So there is a question on traditional knowledge. Perhaps if Dr. Ram Boojh can take this, because by Manjula ji, I would like to know, though we do talk about using the terms traditional knowledge of indigenous community in addressing climate change, has it ever been done in earnest? And has it ever yielded changes? A positive outcome can also play a role in supporting the stopping of the erosion of traditional knowledge. So maybe if you could respond to this.
Yes, in fact, this is very important in terms of, in both ways, when we talk about the climate change, adaptation and mitigation, and also in terms of biodiversity conservation, which is another major global issue. And I was talking about the indigenous communities. They are basically the custodian or holders of this kind of knowledge. And it's, in fact, we did a work on the formal knowledge system that we attain through our formal education, textbooks, and whatever empirical knowledge that we gain. The other one, the traditional knowledge also, if we can think of the scientific knowledge, because it is tried and tested over centuries, the traditions, and it has scientific basis, evidence-based, if we can call it. So there is a kind of, if we mix both, there have been hybrid solutions to many, like the climate smart agriculture, blending of traditional knowledge and of course modern agricultural knowledge. Similarly, like in New Zealand, the Maori tribes, they have a beautiful architectural structure, which is Maori plus the Eurocentric, the architecture, that's a mix up. In India, you will find in Northeast India, in Kerala, several such models. So of course, means traditional knowledge is there, but how to apply it with the informed consent of the traditional communities for solutions of all our global problems, that is very, very important. So it has a very important role.
Right, thank you, sir. So there is a question by Mr. Samir Unhale. Actually, he is traveling, so he couldn't come on video and audio to ask the question directly to Dr. Keith Alverson. He is Joint Commissioner in the Department of Municipal Administration, Government of Maharashtra. So he says that cities would be important players to address the most global challenges, and most importantly, towards the attainment of sustainable development goals. And earlier, he was the CEO of Thane Smart City in the Mumbai city region. Under him, they had tried to prepare a budgetary linkage initiative at municipal budget. So what scope do you think, Dr. Alverson, does International City Network have to create credible impact on sustainable development goal and also for climate actions?
Yeah, thank you. I certainly agree that cities are an important player. I mentioned individual actions, government actions, corporate actions. Municipalities are super important, and I apologize if I didn't mention that. Certainly in the waste management challenge, it's the municipal level that is the primary importance, really, setting the conditions for dealing with that challenge locally. How a group or a network of cities can be useful is less clear to me. It can be useful. You can certainly talk about sharing best practices, sharing lessons learned, but and I'm not opposed to links between municipalities and sister cities and groups like that, but the focus of a municipality in sustainable development has to be on that municipality's own issues and problems. And yes, some small percentage of their action can be learning from other cities, sharing with other cities, et cetera. But I don't think that's the core of the issue. The core of the issue is each municipality thinking about its problems and its solutions. Similarly for companies, companies that pledge offsets. If Microsoft says we're going to buy a bunch of offsets and plant trees somewhere to account for our greenhouse gas, I don't think that's nearly as useful as companies looking at their core business, what they're doing, and reducing their own emissions, even if the number is smaller than their supposed offset number. So looking at your core activities as a municipality, your waste management challenges and solutions, your greenhouse gas emissions and reductions, and your poverty and how to overcome it is really critical at the municipal level. So thank you for reminding us all of that level of government that is so important and increasingly important, because in many, many countries, the percentage of the population living in cities is going up fairly rapidly.
Right. Thank you, sir. Thank you for taking that question. And so finally, I come to the way forward round, and where I would request Dr. Rema, Dr. Ram Boojh, and also Dr. Keith at the end to present just in a few bullet points, maybe a couple of points, as to what do you think is the key to achieving sustainable development goals? Yeah, sustainable development rather. Dr. Rema, I would begin with you. Could you unmute, ma'am?
Well, sustainable development, to achieve the sustainable development, it's a big challenge. But however, actions have to be at from every level, like from individual level, from even the from individual to family to the neighborhood to the local community to the local governance, local body, and then to the the higher structures. So actions at individual level, as I already mentioned, individual behavior change is the key to bring that change, bring the, take on that development activities. So that has to take place. Only a convinced individual can, when he goes to a position in a corporate or in a government or in a decision-making position, he will be able to take an appropriate decision for the development challenges. Sure. Maybe that's a big challenge to, for individual behavior change, but that has to happen. Somehow we have to do it.
Right. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Yes. Dr. Ram Boojh.
Yes, I think I fully agree with what Dr. Rema just said. It's behavior change. And in order to achieve that, I think, as we all say all the time, that education is the key to sustainability. And that is why, in fact, we talk a lot about education for sustainable development, ESDR, sustainable education, sustainability education. And of course, at various levels, the education, advocacy, and empowerment, these all individual, community, industries, is the target, the policy makers. So everyone has to play their own role in this part. And countries are preparing for COP26, as Dr. Keith and you also mentioned. And simultaneously, every country is going to submit their nationally determined contributions, which will have a national will of what actions countries will do on that. And that is going to be very comprehensive, encompassing everything. And of course, the similar will be for the SDGs overview, review, national reviews, which I think you must be knowing about. Our Niti Aayog, the Planning Commission, is preparing. And of course, these are the documents which national will, but definitely we had a national education policy last year, and we talked about sustainability, education, and environmental education to a great extent, and how we could imbibe those into education system, into behavior change, as well as into policy making.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Dr. Keith, over to you. Could you please unmute?
Thank you. Great summary points from both the panelists. From my side, behavior change is important. I would say at all levels, individual, but also corporate, municipal, national. Behavior change is important. I'd also say local constraints are important. So thinking locally about what are the constraints locally, what are the solutions locally, and not saying, here's a solution that worked over there, it's a magic bullet, it'll work somewhere else, we can scale it up. Rarely useful sometimes, but often local challenges, local constraints need to be focused on. And then finally, I made the point before, but I'll make it again, stop concentrating on growing income. Every year, more income. And think more about wealth. What is our financial wealth? What is our environmental wealth? What is our social wealth? And how can we ensure that it's stable and sustained? And the answer to that is not through ever increasing GDP. That's just increasing income. So a more holistic look at our well-being and our wealth, I think, is an important way of thinking about measuring our real development, as opposed to very fixated on a certain kind of financial development. And I'll just stop there with those few bullet points.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was quite very, very profound. And thank you very much to all our panelists for fostering such an understanding, important understanding on sustainable development. We actually need to engage with such core normative values, which just now Dr. Keith mentioned about holistic well-being, so that we can actually move towards the transformation towards sustainable development that we are all aspiring for. So with this, let me just propose the formal vote of thanks. On behalf of the Center for Environment, Climate Change and Sustainable Development at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, I thank our distinguished speaker, Dr. Keith Alverson, for taking time early this morning for you, sir, and for explaining to us the nitty-gritties and also important aspects of sustainable development. I would also like to thank our panelists for today, Dr. Ram Boojh, for taking out the time from your schedule, and also Dr. Rema Saraswathy for taking out the time from your schedules, because I know you are all working at the grassroots level and how hectic it can be for meetings. And I thank all the audience here watching us on Zoom and also on Facebook Live, and for your questions. So stay tuned for more and more such programs, and hope to see you again in future. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.